Specialist Jake Morrison had been assigned to Coalition Outpost Zeta 9 for 8 months, which was long enough to learn that maintaining equipment for 6 different species required attention to detail that went beyond just technical specifications. Each species had their own protocols, cultural practices around their gear, and particular ways they wanted things handled. Jake was 29, 7 years into his military engineering career, known for being thorough and helpful to the point where his supervisors sometimes joked he needed to learn when to stop working. He took pride in keeping everything in optimal condition, often fixing things that weren't technically his responsibility simply because he noticed they needed attention. The outpost housed personnel from 6 different species, and Jake's job was to maintain their equipment and combat gear according to each species' specifications. He'd studied the technical manuals, learned the protocols, and generally managed to avoid cultural mishaps by focusing on the engineering aspects rather than the social complexities. One of the outpost's personnel was Lieutenant Kira Thelvas, a Valkyr warrior assigned to the combat response team. The Valkyr were a proud warrior species with feline characteristics, graceful and powerful, with fur patterns that varied by individual and eyes that could see across broader spectrums than humans. Their culture was built around honor, martial prowess, and intricate social bonds defined through combat and trust. Kira had been at the outpost for 3 months. Jake had noticed her during that time. She was hard to miss, being both an excellent combatant and someone who carried herself with controlled intensity that suggested she took her duties very seriously. They'd had minimal interaction beyond basic professional courtesy. One day, Jake was performing routine maintenance in the armory when he noticed Kira's combat armor on a maintenance rack. Valkyr armor was distinctive. It integrated with their physiology in complex ways, included cultural markings and personal insignia, and was considered an extension of the warrior rather than just equipment. Kira's armor was covered in mud and combat residue from a recent patrol that had encountered difficult terrain. It clearly needed cleaning, and the residue was the kind that would damage the armor's systems if left too long. Jake knew that Valkyr warriors typically maintained their own armor. It was part of their cultural practice. But he also knew Kira had been on back-to-back patrol rotations and probably hadn't had time for proper maintenance. The armor needed cleaning now to prevent system degradation, and Jake had the skills and equipment to do it properly. He decided to help out. He spent 2 hours carefully cleaning the armor, following Valkyr maintenance protocols he'd studied when he first started working with multi-species equipment. He removed the combat residue, cleaned and calibrated the systems, repaired minor damage to articulation joints, and ensured everything was functioning optimally. It was meticulous work, and he took pride in doing it well. When he finished, Kira's armor looked better than it had in weeks, functioning at peak efficiency. When Kira returned to the armory to retrieve her armor, she found Jake putting the finishing touches on the cleaning. Her reaction was immediate and dramatic. She froze completely, her eyes widening, her fur patterns shifting to colors that Jake's brief cultural training suggested indicated extreme shock. She stared at him, at the armor back at him. When she spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "Do you know what that means?" Jake, confused by her reaction, explained he was just cleaning her armor because he'd noticed it needed maintenance and thought he'd help out. He asked if he'd done something wrong, if he'd damaged something during the cleaning. Kira didn't answer immediately. She was clearly struggling to process something, her body language suggesting she was experiencing multiple intense emotions simultaneously. Finally, she asked him to explain exactly what he'd done and why. Jake walked her through his reasoning. He'd noticed the armor was dirty and needed maintenance, knew she'd been busy with patrol rotations, had the skills and time to clean it properly, so he did. Simple act of professional courtesy and helping out a fellow soldier. Kira's reaction became even more complicated. "We need to talk, privately, right now." Her tone suggested this was extremely serious. She led him to a private conference room, ensured they wouldn't be interrupted, and then explained the cultural significance of what he'd just done. In the privacy of the conference room, Kira's composure was visibly strained. She sat across from Jake, her fur pattern still showing the colors he was learning meant shock and distress. In Valkyr culture, she began carefully, armor is not just equipment. It's a sacred extension of the warrior's self, representing their honor, achievements, and identity. Allowing someone to touch your armor is an act of profound trust. Jake nodded, waiting for her to continue, increasingly concerned about where this was going. But the act of washing another warrior's armor is a specific ritual with deep cultural meaning. When a Valkyr washes another's armor, it's a declaration of bonding. It states publicly that the person doing the washing has accepted the role of protector and partner to the armor's owner. Jake's stomach dropped. Kira continued. Traditionally, this ritual is performed between bonded mates or between warriors who have chosen each other as lifelong companions. The act creates a formal bond that our culture recognizes as similar to what humans call marriage. No, Jake said, his voice strangled. No, I was maintaining equipment. I didn't know. I know you didn't know, Kira said, and her fur patterns shifted to include colors that might have indicated sympathy. But that doesn't change what you did or what it means in my culture. By washing my armor, particularly doing so thoroughly and carefully with obvious attention to detail, you have, from a Valkyr cultural perspective, publicly declared yourself as my chosen protector and future mate. Jake felt panic rising. How do we fix this? How do I undo it? I'll apologize, I'll explain to whoever needs to hear it that I didn't understand. There's no simple way to undo it, Kira interrupted gently. The act has been done. The armory has security footage, which means there's a record. According to Valkyr tradition, we are now considered bonded. She paused, her expression conflicted. I can formally reject the bond, which would be my right since you clearly didn't understand what you were doing. But rejection carries its own cultural weight. It would be seen as me declaring you unworthy, which would bring shame on both of us in different ways. What happens if you don't reject it? Jake asked, though he wasn't sure he wanted to know. Then we would be expected to honor the bond according to Valkyr customs. To act as bonded partners, to fulfill the roles of protector and protected toward each other, and eventually to formalize the bond through proper ceremonies. She looked directly at him. The bond implies romantic partnership, though our culture understands that emotional connection develops over time. Jake stood abruptly, pacing the small conference room. This is insane. I performed basic maintenance and accidentally got myself into a cultural marriage. I understand this is difficult, Kira said. I could request exemption from Valkyr cultural authorities, explaining that you're human and didn't understand the significance. But that would require detailed explanation, and would likely result in the authorities concluding that your act was disrespectful. Performing a sacred ritual without understanding its meaning could be interpreted as mockery. They might demand formal apology or other remediation that could damage your career. Their conversation was interrupted by a summons to the office of Commander Vex, the outpost's commanding officer who was himself Valkyr. Apparently word had already spread. Commander Vex addressed the situation with appropriate seriousness. He asked Jake directly if he'd understood the cultural significance when he washed Kira's armor. Jake admitted honestly that he'd had absolutely no idea. Then Commander Vex asked Kira the question that would determine everything. How do you wish to respond to this bond declaration? The room was silent. Kira considered carefully, aware that her decision would affect both their lives significantly. Finally, she spoke. I formally accept the bond. Jake stared at her in shock. Commander Vex's expression suggested this wasn't the answer he'd expected either. Kira continued. While Specialist Morrison didn't understand the cultural significance of his actions, The actions themselves demonstrated qualities that Valkyr value. He noticed I needed help, provided that help with skill and care, and showed respect for my armor even without understanding its cultural weight. These are traits of a worthy bonded partner. I will honor the bond if he is willing to try to understand what it means and learn our customs. Commander Vex gave Jake time to consider his response. He made clear that while Kira had accepted the bond, Jake wasn't obligated to reciprocate. He could decline, request cultural exemption, and face whatever professional consequences resulted. Jake spent the next few days in a state of controlled panic, talking to everyone he could think of who might have advice. Human colleagues, the cultural liaison officer, even the outpost's chaplain who dealt with multi-species relationship issues. He learned that Valkyr bonding was serious, expected to be lifelong, carrying extensive cultural obligations, and would significantly change his life. But he also learned what the bond would mean: mutual protection, deep partnership, a relationship built on trust and honor. He also spent time talking to Kira directly, trying to understand her perspective. She explained that she hadn't chosen this situation any more than he had, but having it happen, she saw it as potentially meaningful rather than just unfortunate. "You showed care for my well-being through your actions," she told him during one of their conversations. "Even if you didn't understand the cultural framework, that care is what bonds should be built on." She asked what he knew about her beyond their brief professional interactions. Jake admitted honestly, not much. He knew she was an excellent warrior, took her duties seriously, kept to herself most of the time. Kira shared more about herself, her background, her family, why she'd chosen military service, what she valued in life. Jake shared his own background in return, and they began actually getting to know each other. 1 week after the incident, Jake made his decision. He would accept the bond. His reasoning was multifaceted. Kira was willing to honor a bond that was formed accidentally, which showed character he respected. Rejecting the bond would damage both their reputations and create ongoing awkwardness. And honestly, getting to know Kira had been interesting. She was intelligent, thoughtful, and had perspectives he found genuinely fascinating. If he was going to be bonded to someone through cultural accident, bonding to someone he actually liked and respected wasn't the worst outcome. When he told Kira his decision, her relief was visible. "Thank you," she said quietly. "I know this isn't what you chose, but I'll do everything I can to make this partnership worthwhile for both of us." She explained what happened next. Proper Valkyr bonding ceremonies to formalize what Jake's armor washing had initiated. They would be expected to live as bonded partners, which included sharing quarters, supporting each other's duties, and eventually developing the romantic aspects of partnership. The bonding ceremonies were complex and meaningful. Jake, with Kira's patient teaching, learned the Valkyr rituals, the significance of each element, the promises he was making through participation. The outpost's Valkyr personnel attended, and their presence transformed what could have been an embarrassing accident into legitimate cultural event. Through the ceremonies, Jake began to understand what he'd committed to. This wasn't just going through motions to avoid cultural insult. This was a real bond with real meaning. Over the following months, Jake and Kira navigated the complications of their accidentally formed bond. They moved into shared quarters, adjusting to each other's habits and personal space needs. They learned each other's work schedules, communication styles, cultural assumptions that created misunderstandings until explained. It wasn't always easy. They were from vastly different species and cultures, thrown together by accident rather than choice. But they were both committed to making it work. Jake found himself performing regular maintenance on Kira's armor, but now understanding the full cultural significance. Each time he cleaned it, he was renewing the bond they'd formed accidentally. Each time, he was demonstrating through action that he valued her safety. Kira, for her part, took seriously her role as bonded partner. She taught Jake about Valkyr culture, protected him in subtle ways from social missteps that could have caused problems, and gradually opened up emotionally in ways she admitted she rarely did with anyone. 6 months into their bond, they faced their first real test, a crisis that required coordinated response from all outpost personnel. A nearby colony came under attack from raiders, and the outpost's combat teams were deployed to assist. Kira was assigned to the frontline response team. Jake, as maintenance engineer, wasn't combat personnel, but he was responsible for ensuring all equipment functioned optimally during the operation. Valkyr bonds included mutual protection. Bonded partners were expected to support each other's duties and safety. For Jake, this meant ensuring Kira's armor and equipment were in perfect condition. He performed the most thorough maintenance check he'd ever done, tested every system multiple times, made minor adjustments that would optimize performance in the combat conditions she'd face. Before Kira deployed, they had a private moment where the weight of their bond became very real. She might be going into combat where she could be seriously injured or killed. He was sending her into that danger with equipment he was responsible for maintaining. Kira told him something important. The reason armor washing is such a significant ritual in my culture is because it represents ultimate trust. A warrior's survival depends on their armor functioning properly in combat. Allowing someone else to maintain that armor means trusting them with your life in the most literal sense. She placed her hand over his. When you washed my armor that first time, you unknowingly demonstrated willingness to take responsibility for my survival. That's why the act is seen as a bond declaration. It's someone saying, I will care for you, I will help keep you safe, your well-being matters to me. The mission was successful, but Kira returned with damaged armor and minor injuries. Jake's immediate response was protective in ways he didn't fully expect from himself. He was genuinely worried about her, relieved she was back safely, immediately focused on repairing her armor and ensuring she got proper medical attention. This was when Jake realized that what started as accidental cultural bond had become something real. He genuinely cared about Kira's well-being, not just as a colleague, but as someone important to him personally. Kira recovered from her injuries, and their relationship continued to develop. They established routines, inside jokes, comfortable familiarity that came from sharing life together. The romantic and physical aspects of their partnership developed naturally over time, as Valkyr culture predicted they would. 1 year after Jake accidentally washed Kira's armor, they hosted a gathering in their quarters for outpost personnel. Commander Vex made an observation to Jake privately. The bond that formed through cultural accident has become one of the strongest partnerships on this outpost. Jake reflected on how horrified he'd been,